Hej och hjärtligt välkomna till dagens sista pass som heter Myten om våra könade hjärnor. Jag heter Vesna Prekopic och har fått den stora äran att presentera dagens sista gäst. Hon har rest väldigt lång väg för att komma hit. Hon är också väldigt efterlängtad, vet jag. Hon heter Cordelia Fine och kommer strax att komma upp här på scen. Cordelia Fine kommer att ge en 30 minuters föreläsning, cirka 30 minuter, och den kommer att åtföljas av en frågestund. Och meningen är att ni i publiken ska passa på att ställa frågor. Vi kommer att ha 2 mikrofoner som finns ute i lokalen så ni får vifta med en hand. Blir det väldigt tyst i publiken så har jag en massa reservfrågor. Kanske kan vi varva dem. Vi får se hur många frågor ni ställer. Men så alla frågor som ni kommer på under tiden, spara dem och passa på att ställa dem. Och jag kommer att strax gå över till engelska även i presentationen av Cordelia. Och strax är nu. So, Cordelia Fine is a professor of history and philosophy of science at the University of Melbourne. She has written several award-winning books that challenge the idea that women and men make different choices because they have different brains. In 2018, she was awarded the Edinburgh Medal for her work on gender bias in research and her contribution to the public debate. Her book, ett svårt ord här, Testosterone Rex, Unmaking the Myths of Our Gendered Minds, won the Royal Society Insight Investment Science Book Prize. And this book actually exists in Swedish as well, if you're interested in reading in Swedish, not in English. And her previous book, Delusions of Gender, The Real Science Behind Sex Differences, was chosen as Book of the Year by several newspapers. And with this small introduction, I would like Cordelia Fine to come to the stage. And I think we should welcome her. Yes? Thank you. Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here. So I'll just leave you and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction and whatever went before that in Swedish, which I'm not sure what quite that was, but hopefully that was also nice too. It's an enormous pleasure to be here and a really great honour. So thank you so much for the invitation and the interest in my work. And I'd like to begin by sharing with you some quotes from a very recent book about gender in the workplace. This book, All the Brains in the Business. And I've chosen this book both because it's very recent, it was published just a few months ago, and also because it's really quite typical for this genre of book. It's a recent example of what I see as a very problematic approach to the topic of gender equality in the workplace. Now, like many other books of this kind, the authors make 2 main claims. So the first claim is that men and women are fundamentally different, and that this difference is deeply rooted in our biology. So they say the way men and women see their worlds is fundamentally different, and that difference comes from basic reproductive biology. So what are these differences? Well, they talk about the brand new neuroscience that they draw on to make this argument, but the differences that they talk about will, I'm sure, be seen as quite old and familiar to you. They are that women are collaborative and empathic, not that interested in status, whereas men are competitive, risk-taking, and focused on solving problems. Now, the second claim that they make is that the inclusion of women in the workplace, particularly at senior levels, matters because it enables organizations to leverage uniquely feminine skills of women and capacities in order to gain a competitive advantage. So they say that properly valuing brain gender diversity in the workplace is one of the biggest and largely untapped sources of competitive advantage for modern businesses. Recent advances in neuroscience provide the key to unlocking it. Now, if you're sitting there now thinking, I hope Cordelia is now going to unlock this neuroscience and tell us how we can sprinkle some pink magic through our organizations and become more competitive, bad news, that's not what we're going to do. From my point of view, there are at least four problems with this kind of approach to gender equality in the workplace. Only two of which I'm going to talk about today, but I just wanted to mention the other two. So the first is that this makes the case for women's inclusion contingent on providing evidence that having them in the workplace will increase innovation, profits, and performance. Now, this is a big demand to put on women, a demand that we don't put on men, and it's actually quite an unreasonable expectation given just how complex organizations are. Now, the second problem is that while there are average psychological differences between the sexes, these unfortunately tend to be grossly exaggerated, misrepresented, and often simply misunderstood by popular writers, feeding into the myths of our gendered minds. The third issue is that while these claims that men are like this but women are like that and we need both are certainly well-intentioned, the problem here is that this men are from Mars, women are from Venus way of thinking about the sexes is actually, as more and more research is starting to show, is actually associated with behaviours and attitudes that are supportive of the gender status quo rather than for change. And finally, the last point is that I think to the extent that we focus a lot on these supposed instrumental benefits to organisations of including women, we of course almost inevitably pay less attention to why their inclusion is important as a matter of justice for individual women, the status of women more generally, as well as the legal and ethical obligation on organisations to ensure equal opportunities for all historically marginalised groups. But I'm not going to talk about this today because it would be like the toddler teaching the grandparents. So, and I just want to acknowledge that part of the ideas that I'll be talking about today are drawn from this new paper that was just published, that was co-authored with some colleagues of mine from the University of Melbourne, Victor Soho, who's an organisational psychologist, and Holly Lawford-Smith, who is a political philosopher. And I put my email address on this slide to say that if you're interested, get in touch and I'll be happy to send you the article. I didn't realise quite how many people there would be in the audience, so I will change that to say, if you're really, really interested in this paper, then email me, otherwise buy a copy. No, please feel free to email me. All right. So while the idea that men and women are hardwired to have fundamentally different natures is, of course, a very old one, how accurate are these claims? Now, over the last 10 years or so, I've been looking very carefully at both the sort of scientific and popular claims that are made about sex differences in brain and behaviour. So in Delusions of Gender, I looked at scientific claims that prenatal testosterone, pre-wire and hardwired sex differences in the brain make males on average predisposed to be interested in understanding how the world works, and that lower level of testosterone exposure makes females predisposed to be more interested in other people's thoughts and feelings and for caring. And that these differences in turn contribute to the sex segregation that we see horizontally. So the fact that we still have a lot of segregation between men and women and the kinds of occupations that they do, the kind of industries they enter. Then in Testosterone Rex, I challenged claims that sex differences in evolved biology inevitably make men more competitive and risk-taking than women, and that these differences in turn contribute to the vertical sex segregation we see, the fact that whatever industry you look at, the further up you look, the fewer women you will find. Now, obviously, in this short time that I have available, I can't go into detail about these debates about the biological contributions to sex differences in brain behaviour and gender-segregated workplaces. But in fact, in a way, it's almost more useful to set aside these debates to a large extent and simply focus on what is at least a bit less controversial question of what those differences actually are. And so I'm going to begin by talking about the size of sex differences in behaviour, which are often exaggerated, and then turn to an issue that has until recently been quite neglected, which is how masculine and feminine characteristics combine in a single individual. And in amongst this, I'm also going to touch on two arguments sometimes put forward to suggest that at least a degree of sex segregation is inevitable, and this refers to differences at the extremes of ability and sex differences in interests in what's sometimes referred to as interest in things versus interest in people. So let me begin by talking briefly about the size of sex differences. Now, on your left here is another book of the kind that I've been talking about. As you can see, it's a book written for people who sit in black leather chairs with a nice view of the city, and they're trying to work out how they can make more profit so they can have an even nicer chair and an even better view. And on the right is a figure from a graph from this book, which supposedly is showing differences in the way that men and women think and act. And so as you can see, according to this graph, the majority of men are factual thinkers and the majority of women are intuitive thinkers. So I would sort of intuit that this table is 1.5 meters high, and a man would get a tape measure and establish the fact of how tall it actually was. Now, I've actually never come across a psychological measure of factual versus intuitive thinking, but what is even more strange about this particular figure is the size of the difference being represented here, which goes against decades of psychological research. Now, in a very well-known study in 2005, an article, the psychologist Janet Hyde synthesized dozens and dozens of statistical reviews, or meta-analyses, if you know what they are, of decades of sex differences research. So this was research that looked at measures of cognition, of social and personality variables, psychological well-being, among other things. And what she found is that of all these many, many differences that people had looked at, and of course people have been fascinated by this question for decades, she found that for 30% of these, when you plot men and women, or males and females, this is what the difference actually looks like. So there is an average difference, but you can see there's a huge amount of overlap between the sexes, and knowing that someone is male or female doesn't actually tell you that much about where they're likely to fall in that distribution or relative to the midpoint. She found that a further 48% were in this slightly larger but still modest range, and then a further 50% were this medium size of difference. Now, if you're wondering what the largest sex differences from this synthesis were, well, they were frequency of masturbation, attitudes towards casual sex, and the velocity and distance that people can throw things. Now, hopefully we can all agree that none of these attributes are things that are important for success in the modern organization. And in fact, even of these, actually only the motor behaviors, the throwing behaviors, were in the same range as the size of the difference shown here. So in short, Janet Hyde found that about 3/4 of the kinds of sex differences, of these kinds of sex differences, are so small that if you chose a woman and a man at random, the woman's score would be more masculine than the man's at least 40% of the time, and vice versa. And just to give you some concrete examples of things related to the workplace, this applies for leadership style, for favouring ethical rather than unethical business practices, and in both so-called masculine values. So this includes things like interest in social status, prestige, control, dominance, and personal success. And you can see here that if you want to dominate someone, you should do it with a moustache and a wink. That's just a little tip for you. And also for feminine caring values. Now, although we've seen that the majority of sex differences in the sort of basic building blocks of behaviour are quite modest in size, But it's sometimes pointed out that what might be more important in explaining occupational gaps is how many men and women there are at the extremes, or high end in particular, of abilities or preferences. So the idea here, and this is again another a very old idea, is that while on average boys and girls and men and women may be much the same, males are more variable in their ability. So there's a bigger spread from the mean. And this means that while there are more males who are doing very badly, there are also going to be more males doing extremely well. Now, this difference has been studied most extensively in relation to scientific and mathematical abilities, and is sometimes drawn on as an explanation for why it is, at least in some countries, we see gender gap in representation in those kinds of occupations. Now, this is a recent, another meta-analysis, basically a statistical synthesis of huge amounts of information. This is actually drawn on the educational scores of more than 1.6 million students. And this is work done by Rose O'Day from the University of New South Wales in Australia. So I'll just quickly draw attention to the fact that these are sort of the means. So you can see that this is if males and females were identical. This is if boys had higher grades. This is if girls had higher grades. You can see that girls are just slightly outdoing boys, but this is a very trivial degree, I should say. Now, underneath here, though, we have the variance, the degree of spread. So you can see this graph here is girls more consistent grades than boys. And you can see that it is indeed the case that girls have somewhat more consistent grades than boys when it comes to STEM subjects. But there are two important points to make about this. So first, other research has found that these sex differences in the ratios of variability can actually vary cross-culturally as well as within a particular nation, depending on which ethnicities you're looking at. So sort of variability in the variability. But also, as you can see in this figure, when you look at this STEM is science, technology, engineering, mathematics. When you look at these non-STEM subjects, in other words, the humanities, you can actually see that there's even more of a difference here between girls and boys than there is for STEM. And this is why the article title is that the gender differences in individual variation in academic grades fail to fit expected patterns for STEM. The simulations show that if you look at the top 10% of any science and mathematics class, you're going to find equal number of boys and girls who would be equally capable of going to a high-ranking university and studying those disciplines. There's no shortage of talent among girls. So we've looked at the size and the shape of sex differences in males and females as groups, but what about individuals? Now, if we go back to this graph, there's something else to notice about it other than the exaggeration of differences. So what you can notice here is that the sort of supposedly masculine way of thinking and feminine way of thinking are represented as being the opposites of each other. So you have a purely factual way of thinking if you're at the male pole, and a purely intuitive way of thinking if you're at the female pole, or you can fall somewhere along this continuum. But the idea is that the more masculine your thinking is, the more factual, the less intuitive it will be, and vice versa. There's no way to draw strongly, be a sort of strong factual thinker and a strong intuitive thinker. However, masculinity and femininity are actually not like this. So we can translate this into psychological measures, for which we do actually have actual measures and data, which are empathizing and systemizing, which is a theory you may have heard of. So the empathizing, systemizing theory of sex differences proposes that the female brain is predisposed to understanding other people's thoughts and feelings and responding sympathetically to them. Mostly a female brain is something that females have, though not exclusively, whereas a systemizing brain or male brain is geared towards understanding systems, so how any kind of system works. Now again, because we're used to thinking of femininity and masculinity as opposites, it's intuitive to assume that empathizing and systemizing operate in the same way as this graph here. In other words, the better your brain is for systemizing, the less good it will be at empathizing, and vice versa. And in fact, the reference to the extreme male brain theory of autism in the title of this article reflects the assumption that as a brain becomes more and more male, it will become less and less female, and therefore you'll end up with a brain that's very good at systemizing, but very poor at empathizing, which is Baron Cohen's characterization of individuals with autism. So the implicit assumption here is that people can be lined up on a continuum from the female pole, extreme empathizers, very bad at systemizing, to the male pole, extreme systemizers, very bad at empathizing. Now, it's important to point out that this study is actually not looking at brains. It's measuring empathizing and systemizing through self-reported questionnaires that you ask questions about how good you are at these things and how interested you are in these things. Now, several years ago, a colleague of mine, he's a philosopher, but otherwise I will let him remain anonymous, he decided to take these questionnaires to see whether he had a female brain or a male brain or a balanced brain. And afterwards he came to me and he looked a bit upset because he'd scored very low on both scales, and so it appeared that he had no brain at all. But what was actually going wrong here was not with him, he's both a lovely guy and a fantastic philosopher, but that there's only actually a very weak relationship between empathizing and systemizing. So in other words, a very high empathizing score can go with a very high systemizing score, and as my friend found out, you can also have a very low empathizing score and a very systemizing score. In other words, instead of people falling neatly on somewhere along this line, they can fall anywhere in these four quadrants. Now you can see if things are this complicated just with two variables, what happens when you consider lots of variables of masculinity and femininity? And the short answer is that things quickly get quite a bit more complicated. So this graph is a little bit overwhelming, but this is a study led by the Tel Aviv neuroscientist Daphne Yoel and her colleagues. And what she did here, or what they did here, is so each of the horizontal line is a different person, and then the vertical lines are a brain structure or a brain region. So she was drawing on very large data sets of brain structure and brain connectivity where there was data on sex differences. And what she was interested in the question is of whether sex differences in the brain, and there are many, but do they add up in a consistent way, or do they kind of mix up in individuals? And what you can see is that while overall there's more green here, which is female typical, so by definition the females have more female typical features in their brain, and males have more yellow, more male typical characteristics, you can see that each of these individuals is a kind of mosaic, and this is a sort of a blowout from one individual. You can see there's a mix of more male typical and female characteristics. So this was the conclusion that most brains are in fact formed of these mosaics. They did the same kind of analysis with behavior as well, with similar findings. Now, I should say here that it is possible to create algorithms that can classify with a high degree of accuracy whether a particular brain belongs to a male or from a female. But what this doesn't give you information about is the structure or the function of that particular person's brain. So it doesn't give you information about the exact number of female typical and male typical features, and nor about which particular features are in which kind of form. But of course, as Daphne Yoel and her colleagues have pointed out, it's the particular form and composition of a brain that determines its structure and its function, as well as its similarity or difference to other brains. And we can make the same kind of argument about behavior. So Daphne Yoel's work shows that rather than there being male brains and female brains, or even a continuum of brains from male to female, there are many types of brain and combinations of behavior. But unfortunately, of course, this is a sort of quite nuanced message that isn't often presented clearly in popular literature. So back to the All in the Brains book, they talk about male and female brains having very different operating modes, and then we have this idea of there being two quite different kinds of brain, the problem-solving male brain and the collaborative female brain. And it's quite striking here how this sort of polarity between the thinking about masculinity and femininity sort of trumps everyone's common experience that, of course, there are people who are both good at solving problems and collaborating, and unfortunately also people who can't solve problems or collaborate. So what are some of the conclusions from this? Well, that you can predict with good accuracy whether someone is male or female based on the combination of brains and characteristics or attributes that they have, but you can't do the opposite. And it's a person's particular combination of attributes that tells you what they're like and how different or similar they are to someone else. And if you are interested in this topic, I would recommend Daphne Uel's book, The Gender Mosaic, which goes into a lot more detail. And I just want to end by talking a little bit about this explanation of gender imbalance in certain sectors like technology and engineering versus nursing and social work as being due to a sex difference that is quite large, which is a sex difference in interests versus things. Now, it's worth saying that actually when you look at the empathizing and systemizing questionnaires, actually those differences are quite modest. Again, this sort of, pick a man and a woman at random, and 40% of the time the woman will be more of a systemizer than the male and vice versa. However, there is a much larger sex difference in what's been referred to as people versus things based on a popular model of vocational interest. So more than 80% of men report a greater interest in things than the average woman, and women are much more interested in people-related activities. But, what is a thing? It doesn't sound like a very scientific concept, and in fact it isn't. So as the psychologist Virginia Navalian has pointed out, the 3 subscales that make up the thing dimension define things so widely. So a thing can be tennis, and it can be the global economy. So this doesn't seem like that the term becomes almost meaningless. And she also suggests that gender schemas have influenced the way that the scales are constructed. So when we think about people doing things, we tend to think about men tinkering what men do, tinkering in their sheds, as opposed to, what a woman might be doing, taking a dress apart and putting it together in a different kind of way. Also, you'll recall that, as I said, being high on empathizing doesn't mean being low on systemizing, and the same is true of interest in people and things. You can be interested both in things and in people. And finally, although I did say that we would sidestep debates about biological influences, it's worth looking at a very common claim that there's solid evidence that boys and girls are born with different interests. So in this op-ed for the Los Angeles Times, the journalist Deborah So writes that a large and long-standing body of research literature shows that toy preferences, for example, are innate, not socially constructed or shaped by parental feedback. And as part of her case, So refers to a group of girls with a genetic condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH. And as she points out, so these girls are exposed to very high levels of testosterone in utero. And as she points out, these girls tend to be gender non-conforming, and they're much more likely to play with toys that we think of as boy toys, even when their parents sort of push them towards the girl toys. And she says this speaks to the vital role of hormones in developing gender preferences and sex differences in behaviour more broadly. Now, many studies do indeed show that this is the case. So when you bring the girls with CAH into the lab and you give them a range of toys to play with, they are significantly more interested in playing with the boy toys than are girls without the condition. Now, this is usually taken to show that girls' and boys' gender stereotypical interests exist in part because of differences in prenatal testosterone exposure, and this in turn explains why we see this occupational sex segregation. But a few years ago, a study led by Melissa Hines at Cambridge University tested the idea that girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia are less likely to obey gender cues. And she and her colleagues made use of the fact that from a very early age, 3 years of age, children are strongly inclined to prefer even novel activities and objects that are labelled as being for their gender or are labelled or are modelled by a child of the same gender. And so what we can see in this graph here is if you look at this, if you look at the 3 bars here, so these are, just look at the females without the condition, you can see this dark bar is memory. They remember who played with which toys. Was it a boy? Was it a girl? And they're showing a clear preference This is if they were behaving randomly, a clear preference for objects that were labelled or modelled as being for them as girls. These are the girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and you can see they haven't forgotten what's happened, but they're much less likely to be influenced by these cues. So in other words, perhaps sex via testosterone affects from whom we learn, but the environment determines what we learn. So maybe these girls play with boy toys as well as girl toys, not because they're expressing the effects of a masculinized brain, but because they have more freedom for some reason from the influence of gender norms. So in conclusion, there are average differences in brain and behavioral attributes, but these don't support making generalizations on the basis of sex. So what I mean by that is we can't make good generalizations about what an individual or their brain is like because they're a male or female, and also making generalizations of what a male is like or what a female is like might be based on some sort of stereotypes based on average differences, which doesn't reflect what actual individuals are like. And this means we have to be quite cautious about how we extrapolate from these subtle differences to thinking about gender segregation in the workplace. So maybe average differences do sometimes contribute to occupational inequalities, but these average differences aren't fixed. And of course, jobs are complicated. People don't just do spatial processing in their head. They do all kinds of different things. And it's a very hard argument to say that of all the different ways that women can be and all the different ways that men can be and all the different ways you can be successful in a role, it's just much more likely that men will fit the bill than will women or vice versa. And the problem here is that, of course, we tend to assume that what we think of as masculine is more important for being successful or doing well in a particular role. I always find it interesting that one of the first biases that you teach in a business school is the overconfidence bias, and yet in organizations we don't teach men how to be modest, but we teach women how to be more confident. Now, the problem here is that, unfortunately, although these claims that men are like this and women like that are well-meaning, there's growing evidence that thinking in this sort of men are from Mars, women are from Venus kind of way is actually associated with attitudes and behaviours that are more supportive of the gender status quo. So there's sort of growing evidence for this. So I'm going to talk briefly about the psychological effects of gender essentialism. And in particular, I want to tell you about some work that I did recently with Leah Skuse from Denmark, from Aarhus University, and Nick Haslam from the University of Melbourne. And in this work, we used two large nationally representative samples, both from Australia and from Denmark. And what we found was that in both countries, people who were more gender essentialist in their thinking were less supportive of gender equality than non-essentialists. So they were less in favour of egalitarian roles in relationships, parenting, work, and education. Gender essentialists were simultaneously more supportive of discriminatory work practices, while at the same time being more likely to perceive those contemporary workplaces as being non-discriminatory. And importantly, in both countries, these effects were independent both of political ideology and for general support for social hierarchy. So in other words, it's not that gender essentialists oppose gender equality simply because they also tend to be conservative or generically anti-egalitarian. There's something deeper going on here. But what we also looked at was whether gender essentialists would react negatively towards women and men who don't conform to gender norms. So this is the so-called backlash effect that many of you may be familiar with. And our thinking here was that people who tend to see gender categories as distinct, natural, and deeply biologically deep-rooted, the way that men and women are intended by nature to be, might be especially critical of individuals who violate those gendered expectations. And sure enough, we found that although the effects were subtle, gender essentialists were especially prone to show backlash. So they showed greater moral outrage than did non-essentialists towards a female female political candidate who was described as power-seeking and towards a male candidate who was not. In fact, in our research, it was only the gender-conforming males who benefited from gender essentialist thinking in terms of how they were perceived. So I just want to wrap up by saying, as you all know, the science of sex differences is a complex, contested terrain that can easily lead us astray. But I do hope that someday we will be able to move beyond these debates and the myth of our gendered minds and extend to men equal confidence in their ability to care and collaborate, and extend to women equal confidence in their capacity to lead and shape the institutions that influence every aspect of our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a splendid talk. Quite funny as well. Good. And we have about, I think, 8 minutes. So I just want to ask the audience immediately, does anyone have a question? Raise your hand if you do. And I can't see anything. So do we have a question? Yes?
Oh, they were right here. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and for your book and for coming here. I'm a huge fan. My name is Victoria Saxby, and I've worked with gender equality for like 25 years, but right now I work a lot with leadership teams. Mm-hmm. And I just find that I can spend a day or even years sometimes talking about social norms and all the background, and at the end of the day I always get the same question, and it comes back to risk-taking. And they seem to, say, but there's a reason for us having the leadership positions, or because we take greater risks. And I was just wondering if you have sort of a quick answer I can say to that, because that's after me having...
Read Testosterone Rex, that's the quick answer.
Yes.
So the not-so-quick answer is that risk-taking shows the same patterns as exactly as what I've shown here. So actually, when you look at things like financial risk-taking, which is often what people are interested in these leadership roles, the differences are tiny, and interestingly, you don't see them in all cultures. They also, when you think of risk-taking more generally, what you find is, so people seem to think that testosterone drives risk-taking. So you think, if you're high testosterone, if you're a man, you're going to be a risk-taker, and if you have less testosterone, you're a woman, you're going to be risk-averse. Now, what you find is actually people's risk-taking ability doesn't come together in this neat way, right? So people are idiosyncratic in the kinds of risks that they will take. So if you sample people who like to skydive, which at least in some countries is actually less risky than giving birth, in the US, not here, I'm sure. But if you take people who like to skydive and then ask them about their investment portfolio, they're not going to be any more risk-averse than someone who doesn't like to jump out of planes attached to a piece of cloth. So the point is that people are quite idiosyncratic in the risks that they take. So you think, well, is testosterone driving this? Because if so, why aren't they risk-taking in all realms of their life, rather than this rather idiosyncratic way of looking at the reality of sex differences, of individual differences in risk-taking. Mm. And the reason that there are differences between people in what risks they are willing to take is the mix of benefits and costs that they perceive. And I think something that's very important for organisations to think about is, do you have equality in the kinds of benefits that come from taking risks? And do you have equality in how much cushioning there is if things go wrong? Exactly. And I think often the answer to that is going to be no.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just ask you then,
yes.
Speaking of testosterone, this is quite simple. You might think that you can't really explain everything with that. How has this been received when you go to having lectures or debate things like this?
You mean
is there
in academic?
Yes, exactly.
Or, well, look, I think there's I think what's surprising is that there's often a lot more common ground than one would actually think. I mean, my book is based on scientific research, so, you know, there's a sort of large body of research supporting it. I think there's a tension in this area of research, which is that people think that politics are being blurred with science, and that people say, well, I don't like the idea that you know, testosterone doesn't create these differences between women and men, so I'm just going to ignore the science. And this is simply you know, simply wrong. And actually, when you look at the history of the science of sex differences, or if you look at the kind of research that I talk about in my books, often what it is actually it's often female scientists, sometimes explicitly coming from a feminist perspective, who are challenging the hidden assumptions in the research, and often the gender biases and gendered assumptions that are actually leading to less rigorous science. And that's actually that's a really important part of the scientific process. That's why we trust science, because all of our claims, our knowledge claims, are put to this very rigorous process of criticism. So I would say the feminist perspectives on science has actually made science better. It's made it more rigorous and more objective as opposed to less objective. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's worth an applause. Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Do we have a hand somewhere? No? Yes? Up there? No? Well, we are... Or did you... Yeah, perfect. One last question then.
Good.
Yeah.
Hi, and thank you very much for your lecture. I can't help, but I have to put the answer regarding female brains, male brains, and age. Do you see any difference between a young brain and an old brain? I'm also thinking of the testosterone. That is slowly.
Yeah. So I don't have expertise in changes in the brain as one reaches the more mature and wise periods of one's life. It certainly is true that hormones do affect the brain. So obviously hormones change over time, both in males and in females. So that will have effects on the brain. I suspect the major issue there is a sort of lack of research, actually, in how that influences the brains of females. Certainly we have that when it comes to, for example, the effects of the contraceptive pill on women's brains, for instance. There's a sort of surprisingly little research investigating that. But I can't speak to that particular question, but it's an interesting one. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And instead of flowers, we are going to donate in your name a gift to the Coalition for the Abolition of Prostitution.
Oh.
So hope you're fine with that. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.